We're going to continue from last week, since we got a little, actually further into it than I'd quite planned. It's, how it happens. I don't know if we'll go quite so long this evening. Trying to just catch a lot of the other pieces that went with the Jewish background, different things. Trying to kind of pull it together into even maybe looking at why a lot of these, just kind of examine the influence of these different groups and why it would affect Christ's ministry and then the first century. And I'm also, so this is why we have a little bit of a float. If there's any questions that I can answer or can find answers for that you might have time for them too. But last week, to kind of set the stage, we tried to explain that the first century general Jewish culture in Judea, and maybe I should say Judea, whichever way you want to pronounce it, was the Roman designation or province for that common area. You had Samaria that was in between, and then Galilee. Galilee was also Jewish. That's where Nazareth and all that. I think we're familiar with that distinction, but it also had a lesser reputation. The higher class tended to be in Judah proper. But at that time you had, we talked about 4 particular groups: Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, and the Essenes, or Zealots. And the Pharisees, if you want to give them like a very quick descriptor, like put a hat on them, it's kind of a blanket statement. You could say they were legalistic, but in the sense of not that they followed law, but they created law and they twisted it. The Sadducees' defining characteristic was, denial of resurrection, I guess. Denial of res. The Herodians were pro-Roman, and the Essenes were anti-Roman. That's a kind way of putting it. Into this mix of varied politics, you will have false messiahs. Remember, there's the time of messianic expectation. The Messiah is coming, been promised, 400 years of silence, all this prophecy. When Christ came, when Jesus came, a lot of them didn't see him for what they saw what they wanted to see, right? And they had in their own head a preconception. When you have a preconception, a notion of how a person will be, is it possible for anyone to try to, shall we say, usurp that particular position? To kind of get in front of the parade and say, hey, follow me? Does that ever happen? Yeah, that happens in a lot of movements, be they political or religious or whatever, throughout history. And there had been false messiahs before Christ. There would be false messiahs after him, interestingly enough, though a lot of them tended to lean more heavily on the anti-Roman thing, especially when they got closer to the revolution, the revolt against Rome, AD 69, destruction of the city AD 70. It took a little time for the armies to get there and do their thing. And they were still destroying Jewish strongholds like Masada and so forth for like 15, 20 years after that. We can talk about Masada in a bit. So you got this whole scene. Now, something I didn't get to last week and was asked about is the nature of the Sanhedrin. It's a part of it. How much are we, we're familiar with the term, right? Shows up in the Gospels. So what was the Sanhedrin? I know I'm supposed to answer that question, but I want to see what some thoughts are.
Council.
Okay, council, that's a good term for it.
Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court. Were there more than one Sanhedrin? See, that's the thing. What is typically referred to as the Sanhedrin was the greater one, greater Sanhedrin, or greater council. The term itself is akin, it's a borrowed word term from Greek that they kind of threw some Hebrew on. It can be translated, it can actually be Sanhedrim, which is a plural in Hebrew. Akin, not exactly the same as the word from which we'll get synagogue, from which you get synagogue or assembly. And so it's a gathering, a council, a thing. And there were lesser ones. They just didn't tend to call them Sanhedrin in a grand sense, occasionally in the different cities. Those were typically made up of 23 elders. And a lot of times when you'd have an elder at the city, I don't know why 23, that's a weird number, but that's the one I found. That they would be decision makers in the regions or in the cities. So like the elders at the gate, a lot of times that's referenced. They would be there. The Sanhedrin was a council of 70. Nominally a council of 70. They were what you could call the supreme court or the highest court of the land. They would deal with the biggest matters. Now, the whole system, again, is unusual because there was no separation between their religious law and the secular law. The religious law was the secular law. They didn't have, per se, like a parliament or a body to create law, even like the modern state of Israel has the Knesset. They didn't have that because they had it. Except for all the traditions or the different things that the Pharisees or certain groups, and not universally, by the way, but they tried to strongly encourage. They didn't have the weight of law because what was their source of law ultimately? Yeah, the Mosaic Law, the Law of Moses, given by Moses in Exodus and then restated in Deuteronomy. You can't just come along and say, well, I like all these things about the Law of Moses, but we need to fix X problems. We're all going to get together and have a parliamentary debate and vote on. That's not how it works, or it shouldn't. Now, they decided a lot of things that way, but not in a, officially, you don't add to that law. It's perfect, it's complete. So really a lot of what they were engaging in was deciding matters of law or interpreting what the law would demand, which gets very, very dangerous very quickly. The earliest renderings or like the history of it, we don't know the full picture of. It's a lot like the synagogues. We find references to it into some early or intertestamental writings, Jewish writings in the period of silence. There's this collection, it's like the Wisdom of Solomon, not to be confused with Proverbs. And it wasn't written by Solomon, it was written later. There is reference in it to something akin to a Sanhedrin. It might have been more one of the local ones. And that's in like, if I remember right, somewhere in the 1st, 2nd century BC. What could have happened is that this kind of system kind of came about alongside the synagogue system while even in Babylonian captivity as a means to try to organize and get the people back focused on the law, back into the land, and then with the giving and the regiving of the law in that form. What's interesting is you don't find any particular commands or calls for this type of a system in the law itself. Now, does that mean it was wrong to do? That's an interesting question.
If you assign power to it, yeah.
Well, see, here's the thing. Why would Jesus then even bother to approach and respect its authority? Okay. Okay. And this is one of those things where it's like, I'm not trying to espouse it one way or another. We do have example of Moses. If you remember, he was being like the judge of everything by himself. And he gets some advice from Jethro, his father-in-law. What did he tell him? Delegate. Get some people to handle the minutia. There's way too many of these people who are prone to complaining anyway for you to deal with all the big things. Save it for yourself. And he did that, and that was fine. There seemed to have been an element within the law, because it gives a lot of specifics. But it doesn't go to the nth degree about when they took the tabernacle up and down, how to collect all the stakes and how to store them. They had to come up with systems that were efficient for them, things which we considered aids or accommodations in order to fulfill commands. And so him establishing, investing this in other people who he trusted to judge, I always wondered if they were all of the priesthood or if it was something else. Because even he himself wasn't of the priesthood, his brother was. That would be the different line. If it was of his line, Moses' line weren't priests. That was his brothers and their ensign branch. So that's interesting. We find at a certain point, I mean, you have Eli and his sons were judging as priests, kids, and they were terrible. But the Sanhedrin, the synagogue system, these means of trying to teach, even if they came about through necessity or through time, didn't seem to cross the line into overriding what God commanded, because it never overrode tabernacle or temple worship. It never overrode these things. Now, they could claim power to themselves they shouldn't have had in time. I know you're just like, yeah. The idea of a council, yeah. They did want the power for themselves, though. And their biggest sin probably would be coming with when they bowed to deposing Annas, which we'll get into the Annas and Caiaphas situation in a second. After AD 70, in the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, destruction of the temple, scattering of the people, they did reform a new Sanhedrin in Galilee, which I found kind of hilarious given how down they were on that region, but it was what was left. They weren't going to go to Samaria. There was a failed attempt to retake the city. There was a failed attempt to rebuild the temple in AD 115. Another failed attempt, I think it was like 170 something, and another in like 2 something. They tried it 3 times within a couple hundred years. Every time it failed. Even when the Romans were like, fine, you can do it, something got in the way. They've been trying to rebuild that temple ever since, and there's no reason to, A, but yeah, I can get you kicked off YouTube. B, they're not going to succeed in that particular purpose. The other reason for having, I suppose, these kinds of lesser councils is that, again, there's the diaspora. They can make their grand decision, bring people in for their grand thing in Jerusalem, but there's still probably local ones in Alexandria and even in Rome or any of the other large areas with Jewish populations. Not Philippi, as we found, but that was a Roman colony. Largely former legionnaires were settled there. The way Roman colonies worked were a whole thing into itself, which I can go into, but anyway. I'm trying to get through all the little pieces. So it's a council. It had, theoretically, the weight of law, but they were supposed to be acting according to the law of Moses as an enforcement thing. How often they did that is kind of subjective. Given the circumstance in the Passion Week, what verdict does the Sanhedrin come down with against Christ for blasphemy? Death. What did the law call for? Death by stoning. Why didn't they stone him?
They didn't have the authority because Rome took it away from them.
Yes. Had it been not such a, this is kind of a creation and a trouble of their own doing, but it was also mechanized by their own desires, because they thought that they could avoid the ire of the crowd in doing so. Caiaphas himself in John says, is it better for one man to die for the nation? Which it says that he was, I don't know if it's, the implication is that this was revealed to him. I don't even know if that was fully inspired, but he becomes this interesting mouthpiece from the opposing point to state a truism, but that's also very pragmatic. That's how Caiaphas was, we'll see. On the other side, you have Pilate, who's avoiding a riot. So he does kind of the same thing. He allows an innocent blood to be shed, but he makes a big notion going out there and wiping his hands of it. Here's the thing. He can do this, but it's not the Jewish state that's stoning him to death. It's his legionnaires who are engaging in a Roman crucifixion. So it's still a Roman execution. So everyone is trying to avoid responsibility. Did you have?
They actually still go to stone somebody. Stephen being
Yep.
one example, and even going as far as to try and start to do that to Paul at one point before he is actually saved by a Roman centurion or some kind of.
It was a centurion.
So it wasn't so much completely that. It can't be completely that. It's also to fulfill God's law, God's word that about how he was going to die, and that wouldn't have been fulfilled with stoning in that sense.
Yeah, I really, and that was Yeah, that's very important because they do stone Stephen to death. The crowds, now they can argue, well, the crowds got out of hand. No. Again, in Christ's case, remember, Hosanna, Hotanna, Tana, Tana, hey, right there, praising him like 6 days before. Oh, he's entered, the king is here. All of a sudden, let his blood be upon us. But those crowds are getting ginned up. Now again, crowds are terrible things. Crowds aren't intelligent. Doesn't take away their individual will. They're getting ginned up, but who's ginning them? It's those leaders. They probably didn't fear even the Roman state. If they had any fear, it was probably of that crowd. If things, because they flip so quickly from love to hate. Maybe they go back to love and then take it out on them. But they weren't afraid to use that authority. They stoned Stephen. You're right. Paul is in the midst of what was almost going to be a riot, and the only thing that saves him, and it was based on a false accusation, because he took Timothy with him to the temple to make a sacrifice, which is interesting of itself. It's like, Paul, what are you doing? Well, he was fulfilling a vow. He had taken a Nazirite vow, is a theory. It never actually says that. But he was fulfilling something. It wasn't a sin sacrifice, because that would have been inappropriate. But that doesn't mean that still culturally as a Jew, he couldn't engage in the vow practice. He takes Timothy in there. He can. Timothy had been circumcised so as to keep that barrier away, but his mother was a Jewess, his grandmother was a Jewess, and therefore he had that claim. Titus was the one whom Paul refused to force that upon because it wasn't about binding salvation, it was different things. But they started the rumor they took a Gentile into the temple, and everyone's freaking out. Now there's that sign, Gentiles beware, penalty of death. They're ready to stone him. The centurion happens to come along, and Paul's like, I'm a Roman citizen. And that's when they're like, they're saved by the centurion and the armies, and then they detain him. But they still, even when they moved him from Jerusalem over to Caesarea, to a more secure location, even from the Tower of Anatolia, there was a conspiracy to capture him on the way, which would mean attacking Roman soldiers who were his guards. That's how much he was hated. So they would act in that behalf. It's just that particular passion. There's a lot of political machinations going on. But they were the ones who brought down the verdict. Pilate saw nothing. All right, so the Sanhedrin would meet at certain times of day, typically. On that day, they met at night, which was uncommon. It was an emergency called session, which was illegal. They would meet on any day, save the Sabbath or a high holiday. This was right before the Passover and near the Sabbath. So they were cutting it pretty close, especially when sundown approached on Friday. Iffy. There's an implication, it's hard to actually fully prove, but I've seen it stated they didn't even call the full 70 for that particular, so they didn't have a quorum. Because they wanted to shove this through. But like any other thing, most of what we really know about them beyond that is that they were like any other political council, which had its own desires. They wanted their own power. It was primarily of those of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, with maybe some independence, for lack of a better term, mixed in. You wouldn't have very many Herodians. They wouldn't be popular. The Zealots, a lot of times considered them to be collaborators. They were, especially with Caiaphas. And so their internal quibbles were over matters of curiosity in Jewish law or Jewish belief, resurrection being the big one. That's why when Paul is brought before him, I'm being persecuted for a belief in the resurrection of the dead. And the Pharisees are all like, hey, you got to leave this guy alone. No, and they start fighting each other. He's genius. But they also were who Peter, James, and John were brought before and said, stop preaching this name. And they would beat them and send them away. They had the authority to do a certain number of things. They appear in various forms, but even as a group of people, it really gets down to those who are the leaders of those parties. And it's a lot of the push of your religious figures. Gamaliel is an interesting one in there because he doesn't seem that bad. He seems a little more reasonable. But then you have Annas and Caiaphas. Now, anyone familiar with the difference between Annas and Caiaphas? Who was the high priest? Oh, yeah, that's the thing. It's like Annas, yes, who is practicing as high priest? Caiaphas. For whatever reason, and there's still debate over it, why. I was trying to find something on that, and it's a lot of times like, well, fell out of favor, did the wrong thing. Around AD 15, 16, somewhere in there, Annas was replaced while alive, which wasn't unheard of if they became infirm or incapable, but typically they held it till they died, by his son-in-law, Caiaphas, who was deemed more politically reliable by the Roman states. The Romans used their power to install him. The problem was, a lot of the time, he had the position, but everyone deferred to his father-in-law. When they take Jesus to one of them, they go to Annas first. Now, I've seen explanations like, well, his palace was just the one that was closer. No. They went to Annas, who was like, well, and then they went to Caiaphas, so that he could get his marching orders. Because the idea is that a lot of times Caiaphas may have been more just kind of, for whatever reason, maybe Annas just said something bad, upset a governor, spoke wrong of the emperor at some point. Caiaphas was the mouthpiece, but Annas had the real power. It's created this interesting dynamic. And it made a certain criticism of the priesthood in general and the council by those who might be of more of the Essene zealot perspective of you cowed, you bent over to the whim of the Roman state. You listened to what they wanted. And you're not supposed to do that. This is our system. This is our thing. This is, Annas, by right, should be the high priest. Which begs an interesting question, too. So you get the Day of Atonement comes around. Is that Yom Kippur? Or is that, I sometimes get a couple, no, is that Rosh Hashanah? There's a couple of them that I get, anyway, Day of Atonement. One of them's like New Year's, one of them's that. Rosh Hashanah, I think, is New Year's and Yom Kippur. I can have them backwards. Anyway, what happens on the Day of Atonement under the law? What's the high priest supposed to do? Okay, he offers sacrifices, enters with blood. How does he do that? Okay, okay. What? Yom Kippur. Okay, I'm getting even more basic than that. Where does he physically go that you'd never go? He enters into the Holy of Holies. There's a possibly apocryphal understanding that's out there, and it's still impossible to prove, but I've heard it multiple times, you probably have too, that they would tie a rope around his waist. You ever heard this? On the theory that if he offends God, they can drag his body back out because they can't get anyone to get him, and he would defile it. I could see it being a believable thing to do because it fits their mindset just as much as the idea of 39 lashes. And that idea of the law says you can strike someone 40 times, they would do it 39 in case they miscount it. That's where 39 lashes comes from. You give that chance that human error gets into the equation and that it would cause offense. Even though, on balance, a lot of times God accounts for human error, but it's so of that form. So he goes in there. Well, who goes in the tabernacle? Who goes into the Holy of Holies? The high priest. Well, which one? That's the thing is I don't know what they did then because they're very unclear with this whole dichotomy of how that really panned out. Did Caiaphas put like the show on and then step away and let Annas do it? Or did he go in himself? And then was it acceptable? It's not who God asked for or whom God appointed. It creates a very interesting mess. And you might think, well, what's the big deal? It's just a position. That's the way the Romans took it. You're just this religious guy. Why can't it just be this other guy? Oh, he has to be this. Fine. he's your son-in-law, what's the big deal? But it's no minor thing. And if you're willing to accommodate at such a grand, key level, where else are you willing to accommodate down the line with how the law worked? And just how corrupt is this system from the top down? Yes, and it was time for that. Again, Eric's opinion, chapter 5. But the old was given away to the new. Everything needed to be physical. It was swept away. It needed to be swept away. We don't have, the Ark of the Covenant isn't in a warehouse hidden away somewhere with a burning swastika on the side or whatever. It was melted down for gold. There is a victory arch in Rome which depicts something very similar to it. So it might have still been around, or a copy may still have been around when they took it in AD 70. There's debate whether it survived Babylon or if they had to make another one, which would make sense. I mean, there were a lot of the vessels that survived because that's what Nebuchadnezzar's son or grandson, depending, was drinking from the night he died. But all that was gone. Gold vessels get melted down. Every brick is knocked off the other because they had gold inlay in them. Everything was wiped clean. You think, well, why? So that man doesn't get obsessed over physical things because it's not about physical anymore. Yet, still, what do? We look for relics. You have tours of the Holy Land, and it's like, this is where Jesus sneezed. You know, something. We get enamored with the physical. A lot of the religious groups run into that direction. A lot of them go to some weird places with it. It is.
It's all based on what I can see, feel, hear, touch, taste. So it is the senses. So it is the physical. I don't know anything.
And that's why the old law, while perfect, was limited and served a distinct purpose for a unique people for a unique period of time. And it was only about 1,600 years. That's it. It can be remembered as a model and gives us guides on sin and how to behave, and was an example to nations outside it. Obviously, they heard something or had some understanding, because how else can you go to Nineveh and tell them to repent? You know? But it wasn't about the thing. The thing was just ultimately existent so one person could actually pull it off and live under it perfectly, and then be sacrificed anyway. And that's the part that's the rub. And there are so many things in it. The Passover itself, the Paschal lamb, the scapegoat that would be released out, and the killing of them outside the city, and all those factors all come together focusing on that. The law is done away with. Something different is put in its place. And it has demands, but they require you to think instead of follow a Sears Roebuck calendar or catalog level of rules by the time the Pharisees got a hold of it. So with that in mind, you have the Pharisees and the Sadducees. You don't hear as much about their Herodians or the Essenes, but I just want to give them that they're there. They ask questions of Jesus. Sometimes they're identified, scholars or the scribes. Sometimes they're not. Famously, I think it's Matthew 24-ish, before the big, well, maybe it's 22, 20, somewhere in there before he has his big discussion about what is to come. You have the last time he's challenged. And it's during that last week. The last time he's challenged by a representative of the Pharisees and a representative of the Sadducees. And after that point, they just don't ask him any more questions because they just realize they can't trick him, they can't co-opt him. All they can do is kill him. And each of those questions really belies, and we talked about this a little bit last week, it belies their philosophies. The Pharisees, what do they ask about, if you remember? Nope, the Sadducees ask about marriage. What do the Pharisees ask about? At least as Matthew lays it out. No, they were focused on it, but in this particular case, they ask about taxation. I'm remembering correctly, they ask about, taxes. I could be misremembering, but I think that's how it all lines up. Because they do make big deals about working on the Sabbath. And again, that's to appeal to the particular Jewish audience that were law-keeping in that way. Not everyone listened to all their little petty rules. And they were hypocrites about it anyway. When Christ went, if your goat or sheep falls in a pit, you're going to get them out. But the question of taxation, that would get him in trouble, not just with them. That would get him in trouble with the Herodians, who are pro-government, and like, hey, yeah, what about this? Are you a revolutionary? And the Zealots, who are you the king? It was meant to trip him up with everyone. And they thought this was the thing. And he answers, well, give me a denarius, whose inscription is on there, Caesar's. Rend to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. That had to frustrate them. Because what does that mean? It means a lot, actually. And it also really encapsulates a lot of what he'd been talking about in the Sermon on the Mount. And everything else is about things that are more important than the earthly things, and the separating of the two. But it also fits the Pharisees, because they were they were law experts. They thought they had a thing. Now, the Sadducees come up with a big loophole law bit too. And there's, as we mentioned last week, what did the Sadducees ask about?
Whose wife and whose husband in heaven?
Yeah. A man marries, his wife dies, remarries, she dies, and so on to like 7 wives. They all die. This guy is either bad luck for women or a black widower, I guess. Is that the term? I don't know. It's very, very suspicious. Maybe don't let him cook. I don't know what the deal is. It's like, who is he married to in heaven? And he says, you don't understand. You'll be like the angels in heaven, neither male nor female. Now, people run with that to a very weird place. But he's talking about a different nature. But they thought they had him. They thought this was their, like, ace in the hole. It's like, if you believe in the resurrection, well, consider this earthly scenario that we've invented and see how it works with your system. It's much like if you're on a desert island and you're all by yourself, who baptizes you? It's like, are you on a desert island all by yourself? Why are you asking this question? But it's one of those kind of things. He also then proves the idea of the resurrection by the tense of a verb and so forth. But that's the thing. Both of those fit their mindset so much. And when you can understand, even reading through the Gospels in general, it's easy to forget that Christ is presenting his ministry primarily to the Jews. They get first dibs. Does he interact with any Gentiles? Actually, several. Does he have bad interactions with the Gentiles? Most of the time, they're pretty good. He meets a centurion who he says has more faith than anyone else he's met. A centurion, one of those Romans. I like to headcanon that that's actually Cornelius, because he is another centurion that seems to have something figured out better than some. I'm a man under authority. I just say this thing. You just say it and make it so, and it'll be fine. You don't have to be there to heal my... What? Wow. The thing is, he was still, while he interacted with them, he was focused on them. So a lot of the Sermon on the Mount, a lot of those interactions, when you see it from the perspective, he's preaching to an audience that is knowledgeable, an audience that has this expectation, an audience that has a lot of these things. There's some weeds mixed in there that have to be cleared, but they're eager. They just have to move beyond what their leaders have been telling them for years. And that's what he focuses on hitting on so much. Unless your righteousness surpasses the scribes and the Pharisees, you won't let enter the kingdom of heaven. You've heard it said. I think that'll add a little more to your thinking when you read the Sermon on the Mount of what he's really meaning about what you have heard it said. Because a lot of times we just assume that he's just quoting. Yes, you have heard it said, but he's not quoting the Bible, first of all. Love your friends and hate your enemies isn't actually a biblical notion. But who is the one who is saying these things? The same people he has to define what a neighbor is to, because they were finding reasons to say, oh, I'm supposed to love my neighbor, but my neighbor is this very narrowly focused thing, and it's certainly not a Gentile. It's certainly not one of those tax collectors. And he's like, no, love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah, I'm already doing that. I'm loving the people that think just like me and look just like me and are just, no. When he says, you have heard it said, but I say to you, he not only takes what the law demands, then he elevates it to the next level. Because even the old law, perfect as it was, only went so far. Love your enemies. What? You have heard it said. You know, you can look, but they had made a whole bunch of. I don't know if I want to go here, but I'm going to. You have the Torah. What is the Torah? It's the law specifically. You could say it includes the 5 books. The 5 books is the term is Pentateuch, but yeah. But when they say Torah, they mean law, but that would include Genesis as well when they say the law and the prophets. Then there's the Talmud and the Mishnah. The Talmud and the Mishnah. Again, in a formal sense of how these different things were compiled, happened years after Christ in time. But there were still these extant versions of these commentaries and thoughts on the law, even going back into the BC. And a lot of times that Talmud and Mishnah, that commentary on the law would be like this in the library, and these would be huge. And it's all commentary on the law. And that's a lot of times what they were quoting, if not formally, but eventually they would, this Rabbi Ben Rabbanbai quoted, that's what they quote. And there was a saying, what the Torah prohibits, the Talmud permits. And I went with the theory that God is don't do X or do Y. And their commentaries would then needle it down to just how do that Y applies and why you could still do X in these particular cases. Okay? Yeah. So when he's going after them about their complaints, oh, you're working on the Sabbath. Well, I'm Lord of the Sabbath, so there. But also, they're not working on it. They're just plucking the heads of grain. You've created this whole thing. What does the law say about honor your father and mother? And there was honor your father and mother, and he attacks them for this. There was a command to set aside, to take care of your typically it would be your widow mom, because the way the age gaps worked and the age expectancy of dad, he's dead. I mean, Joseph is not mentioned as being around even when Christ is 30-something. He probably is gone by then. So you're taking care of mom. Does Christ take care of his mother? It's like, John, behold your mother, behold your son, would she have been taken care of? Yeah. But he makes a point, because that's what a good son did. The Pharisees come along, and they're like, well, here's this sum of money that I could use to take care of my mother. Or here's a part of these funds, or an inheritance that's coming. It's supposed to be used for that purpose. And there were certain legal things that were pressured about honoring your father, but they created this system. Well, it's gifted to God. I'm giving it to God instead as a religious offering. It puts it in a trust, or it puts it over here in a place to where now it doesn't have to be spent on mom anymore. In the name of a religious practice, they dishonored their parents. And he gets on them for that. Because that's what happens when and the Sanhedrin smiles at that.
We make the details the law. We make the details of God.
Yeah, it's when it gets to that point. So what I wanted to bring out here is this is the world that he is interacting with. And there's a lot of, again, Joe the Jew, everyday, people of the tribe of whatever, Benjamin or Issachar or Zebulun or whichever, they're just doing their thing. Fishermen, carpenters, they're doing their thing, and they're getting these pressures. Jesus comes along, he's talking to this person. You have heard it said, but you need to hear this. When he tells his apostles, his disciples, behold, the fields are white unto harvest. We like to quote that a lot. Contextually, he is talking about people who are prepared and know God and know a lot of those things. It isn't meant as a broad statement of general evangelism. I hate to be the guy, but he's talking about they were in a unique position because he came for that. They're ready. Now, some of these same people are going to cry for his blood. Many of those same people are going to feel really bad about it at Pentecost and cry out for help. But still, only 3,000 of them respond. And we're like, only? That's a huge number. Versus the crowds, still a minority. And they were growing. It was still a minority. And there was still a lot of thinking in power and positions and power plays. Different groups here and there, different elements. So, I don't know. I've been trying to paint a picture here. I don't know if it's made kind of sense. Are there any thoughts, any questions that are really nagging at you? John, I know you're the one that gave the... I just want to know if I hit everything.
I was wondering about the Hellenistic Jews,
Mm-hmm.
do you think any of them helped to make up the Sanhedrin, or were those all the Hebraic Jews?
I don't. Again, this is one of those cases where I can't speak with any direct knowledge. My gut would be no. The Hellenistic Jews tended to be treated kind of second-class citizens. Paul really wasn't. Not in the same way. He was part of the diaspora and lived in Tarsus, but he came from. They all were. A Hellenistic Jew would be more. It's hard to describe. Philip and Stephen were Hellenistic Jews, and the ones they tended to be most upset about tended to be ones that adopted more of the Greek culture while still in Judea proper. And how far that went, it gets tough to read. It's like they're using Greek names, which is unusual. How much their culture was adapted is debated. But they weren't, Paul probably wouldn't have been able to get the position he had under the feet of Gamaliel with that kind of a history. And he doesn't have a Greek name. It's Saul. I mean, that's a pretty famous name, right? Just because you didn't grow up there didn't mean you didn't have bona fides. Well, he's a tribe of Benjamin. He's a Benjaminite, a Jew of Jews, a Pharisee of Pharisees.
I mean, family makes a difference too. It
Mm-hmm.
really does.
That does.
Paul had the right,
Connections.
connections
And that could be part of it too.
Yeah.
Though interestingly, Caiaphas isn't a very Hebrew name either, so that's something to consider. So I don't know. Typically when they spoke of the Hellenists, though, they tended to be less favored, and there's a history from when they were occupied by the Greeks and then later on that may have led to them being like lower class because they were at some point collaborated, or there's things that come to play.
They had their own synagogues?
I don't know. It's possible. But here's the thing. All we really run into a lot biblically about them, because typically the conflicts you see are going to be between Jew and Gentile in a lot of cities. It's Acts 6. The Grecian widows, the Hellenistic widows, were being ignored. Why? Why would that happen? But they're all Christians. But again, it's something that just kind of organically came about because that's what they'd already been doing. And they were complaining about it. And the apostles were like, yeah, this is dumb. This shouldn't happen. Choose 7 men from among yourselves to take care of this. And they choose 7 Hellenistically named men. Interesting. but I think it was kind of genius because you didn't want division right off the bat and took care of the problem. But inertia, for lack of a better term, and I don't know how far that really went because they would still be accepted out that, but it was, and it required Peter and John to come down to lay hands upon them, but they're accepted. They're the next step. That's true. Yeah, it is true. It's like in Judea, around Judea, Samaria, and to the end of the earth. Yeah, it's in Acts 1:8, I believe. It's the outline of the book. But yeah, once they were allowed, the half-breeds, then you have Peter sent to Cornelius, and opens the door there. Interesting that Peter gets to do that because he's not going to be the one that's going to work with the Gentiles largely. He's going to have an issue later on hanging out with them and has to be confronted. But Peter was the one who was told that he had the keys. Had nothing to do with him being pope or anything special. But he said he had the keys. What do keys do? Open doors. Who was the first one to speak to the Jews? Who was the first one to speak to the Gentiles? And it opens up from there. But they still have to have the council at Jerusalem in Acts 15 to settle some things. You have some Pharisee converts that are reactionary to this whole thing, among others, and they still have to deal with it. But it was again, it's a completely new mindset from what they were used to. They would go all the way around Samaria to avoid it. Now, here's the thing: in Jesus' ministry, did he go to Samaria? Yes. Goes to the woman of the well, goes to Sychar, preaches to them. So that's already setting in the apostles' mind, at least, hey, this is something different. Why are we interacting with these people? Okay, so maybe that kind of opened their mind a little bit for what was to come, because the Samaritans were worshiping on a mountain. That came out weird. They're worshiping on a mountain on Mount, I shouldn't have done that because I can't remember. That's going to be one of those trivia things. Something Zim, I believe. There is still, there's only a dozen of them left that claim to have the Samaritan Pentateuch or the Samaritan Torah, their very unique system and everything that are still, Gerizim, I believe, yeah. But why did they worship on the mountain? They weren't allowed in the temple. They were refused entry because of how they were born. Where did they come about originally? Well, why did intermarrying happen? So here's the thing. When the Babylonians came in and destroyed Jerusalem, they took a whole bunch of slaves and various things. They didn't take everyone. There was still an underclass and people in there that were in the land. And they intermarried with others, probably just to survive, right or wrong, and that led to that. And then when they came back, a lot of them had to put away foreign wives too, so there was already intermarriage there, but there were, again, descendants from that. And sins of the father, unfortunately, well, right or wrong, the consequence of, not necessarily, the earthly outcome of, not that they're going to be punished in a sin-punish way, but it's just the realities of how it comes about. You have this nation, and now they're allowed back in. Edom would kind of fit that too, I think, because they'd be kin. So, wow, it is already okay. Any other thoughts? Again, I've been trying to paint pictures here. I wanted to give a background. That's about all I had kind of really figured out for the couple weeks here. We'll have singing next week, as plan holds. And if anyone has any thoughts of something else they want to explore, please let me know. Gina?
Mom talked to Debbie today. They took Truman to the VA hospital. His legs were really red, so they were checking for blood clots. And they said something about having seizures. So he'll be in there for several days.
Okay. So Truman's in the VA hospital being checked out for legs being very red, blood clot issues, possible seizures. So they're going to be watching him for a while then. And they might put an EEG on him. That's not fun. But especially, okay, prayers for both of them. Yeah, certainly. Anyone else anyone need the Lord's Supper this evening? I think, if my memory serves, everyone was here. Okay. Anyone else? Anything else to mention, or anyone else to mention?
You might want to, Brad Holt, he's my cousin, mom's brother, son. down to second half, didn't get back up. He was dealing with some health issues for a while, so. Didn't hold that one. I think he was 70 or 71.
Sorry, I'm just trying to get notes. Okay, so it was your cousin?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Brady's cousin Brad Hull went to sleep, didn't awake, passed away in his sleep. So prayers for the whole family and this sudden loss, certainly for comfort and everything.
John Sanchez is home recovering, under medication. Did a bunch of tests, and right now no operation, just medication.
Okay. John Sanchez that was brought in with a possible issue with a vein of some sort.
Dissected cardioid artery.
Dissected cardioid artery. That,
The layers in the artery actually separated.
oof. Okay, that's fun. So he's home, recovering. Hopefully it can be managed with medication for now, no surgery. We'll pray that that stays the same way. Okay. And Bell's palsy in the face.
That may pass. Anyway, prayers are needed.
Certainly. Anyone else? Okay. Okay. Anyone else? Well, if there's nothing further, would you bow with me and we'll go to our Father in prayer, close this evening, and offer these words of prayer. Father, we thank you for this time to discuss and to look into kind of the background of what was going on when your son came and preached and interacted with those that were seeking and weren't. And we can learn from both reactions they have and just help us to want to ever better understand what you want us to know. We thank you for times to study like this. We ask that you be with this evening. We have those that are on our heart, and we're thankful we can come to before your throne. We ask you to be with Truman, that whatever the issue with the clot is can be dealt with, and that it not be anything too serious, or with the seizures, they can figure out a way to help him to be more comfortable. And it's likely very confusing. We ask your special comfort with him and with Dovey, especially as he's at the VA, that they can find under observation, maybe find something to help him to feel better. We ask you to be with the whole family, with Brad's passing suddenly. We just pray comfort and your love with them. Sometimes things are known and sometimes they're sudden, and we just ask your special care with them. We ask that you be with John Sanchez, who's recovering. First, the medications can do what is necessary and that he can heal, and that the surgery will not be necessary, but also this palsy that's developed in his face, that, as I say, it may pass. We pray that can be the case, that will not be an ongoing issue, but that he can be comfortable, well, and to know that he's missed, and that he can be made well. I also ask you to be with Amy with these tests that are going on, that whatever issue is going on, that we found, and she can be helped, and that to be real, nothing overly serious, but in all things we place her in your care. We again thank you for tonight. We thank you for this family. We thank you for today, for being able to worship and be together. Be with us as we go back out and walk our walks, that we remember whom we serve, whom we can lean on this earth, and that we can lean on you beyond. Please keep us focused. Forgive us. We stray far too often. We thank you for your Son who made it all possible. It's in his name we pray.